Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof, fourth part thereof for today, because I did one late last night that ended up coming out first, my Geopolitics video, really for yesterday, and this is another Geopolitics video for today, and actually it's worthwhile doing because there's an awful lot happening today, and I think you need to be aware of what's going on. Zelensky and European leaders are meeting in Hungary at the moment. We've still got the fallout of the Trump election victory, and we're going to start with that. I know I've explained this in a previous video, but you need to understand this. So you haven't seen the previous video, you need to understand this for the context of what else is taking place. So the Wall Street Journal has reported that the Trump team is considering forcing Ukraine to suspend NATO membership for 20 years. President-elect's team reportedly considers asking Ukraine to defer NATO plans as part of a strategy to end Russia's war. Now, this is a breakdown of what they're saying. So Trump's advisors recommend freezing the war, consolidating Russia's conquest of approximately 20% of Ukraine's territory. Kyiv promises not to join NATO for at least 20 years. In return, the US will continue to supply Ukraine with weapons to deter future Russian attack. The front line will remain in place, and both sides will agree on a 1,200-kilometer demilitarized zone. We do not send American men and women to maintain peace in Ukraine, and we don't pay for it. Let the Poles, Germans, British and French do it, said one member of Trump's team. So you can discuss the merits and issues with that. I mean, there are some quite interesting elements to this, but I still find it problematic that you are essentially demilitarizing a large part of Ukraine and freezing the front lines and giving Russia, it appears, control over what they've already taken, and that will include Crimea. So I don't know that the Ukrainians would ever sign up to something like that, which means this is just an excuse for, and the US would know that this is potentially a US excuse to extricate themselves from the conflict. Right, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said the strengthening ties between Russia and North Korea are not only a threat to European security, but also to the United States. Russia is delivering the latest technology into North Korea in return for North Korean help with the war against Ukraine, and this is a threat not only to the European part, but NATO, but also the US, Rutte said before a meeting with European leaders in Budapest. I look forward to sitting down with Donald Trump to discuss how we face these threats collectively, he added. And of course, this is an appeal really to Russia. This is an attempt to, appeal to the US, an attempt to communicate to the US, to Trump really, how important the success of Ukraine is in the war against Russia for the US, right? Okay, going on to my next one. Now, interestingly, this is Blue Sky. I'm trying to move across to Blue Sky where I can. It's going to be impossible to wholesale do that, but I detest Elon Musk, and so where I can get my information from Blue Sky, I will. Yeah, most of the OSINT community is still incredibly active on Twitter, as well as pretty much everyone. So there needs to be a kind of critical mass of people on Blue Sky to make it a sole place to be. I need basically everyone to be there, and of course everyone's not there. They're at Twitter, but still there are a number of people over there, and I'll try to use it anyway. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has voiced confidence, says War Translated, that NATO countries will soon spend over 2% of GDP on defence, aligning with Donald Trump's past criticism of Europe, speaking before the European Political Community meeting in Budapest. So all of them will soon do that. There's been a huge increase in the number of countries that are doing that, and then you also need to look at other expenditure concerning, say, the war in Ukraine that isn't, say, direct spending on defence. Should that be included? There's all this debate about, 2% of expenditure on defence. Well, you've got nations like Germany that are supporting Ukraine in a holistic way, such as, for example, the welfare system with education for refugees. Now, that's not spending on defence, and that's not spending on say weaponry or bilateral military support for Ukraine, but it is spending money on Ukraine as part of the wider remit for supporting Ukraine so that they can prevail in the war, right? So there's all this. If you think of it in really reductionist terms, there's all this money that needs to be spent on Ukraine. Now you can just take part of that as you're spending on your own defence as being part of NATO, but NATO's remit is kind of to make sure that Russia doesn't prevail, right? That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's initial raison d'etre. And so countries have a bunch of money to spend, and then a bunch of money to spend on making sure Ukraine prevails. And then there's this crossover of, well, money on your own defense, but then that's actually being put towards deterring Russia and helping Ukraine to prevail. So the US can come along and say, right, I think everyone needs to spend 3% now of defense on GDP. So there's talk about how Trump might be moving the goalposts to try and, again, given an excuse to extricate themselves not just from the Ukraine war, but from NATO generally. And then, so you're saying, okay, so you need to spend more on defense, but actually, how about you spending more on humanitarian support for Ukraine? Because Germany does that, Poland does that, and they're doing, Poland's doing more than the US as a percentage of spending on defense, as a percentage of GDP spent on defense. And they're supporting Ukraine in all these other ways. And what is, I mean, I suppose it gets back to the point of what is the point of NATO, and therefore what's the point of spending on defence? And if this is all going towards the same goal of not allowing Russia to prevail, that's kind of the raison d'etre for NATO, and that's why you're spending on defence. But it's also why you're supporting Ukraine in humanitarian ways as well. Then it's all part of the same thing. And I don't think this kind of approach from, say, Trump and some in the US saying the only defining metric of qualification to be a part of NATO is expenditure on defence. I think that's problematic, is kind of where I'm going. Sorry, I'm not sure I'm communicating myself well enough. But the money spent by other countries in other ways to support Ukraine is to the same ends and goals of NATO, and therefore should be seen in terms of on a parallel with NATO expenditure, NATO countries' expenditures on their defence industries, on their defence. Euromaidan Press says, quoting Ursula von der Leyen, for our security and our defence and for supporting Ukraine, Europe has to take more responsibility. These are issues of mutual interest with the US, she says. We will build on it. At the same time, we have a compass and our future is in our hands. So this is a much longer speech here. Let's just dip into it to begin with and see if it's worth me doing a separate video on this speech.
European leaders that we share. Let me take the opportunity to again congratulate Donald J. Trump for his clear victory. I'm looking forward to working with him again to strengthen the transatlantic bond. We will discuss here specifically the topics for the next years ahead of us. We've shown that Europe can take responsibility by standing together. We've shown this in the pandemic. Standing together, we overcame the economic impact of the pandemic. We've shown this in the severe energy crisis that was unleashed by Russia's war in Ukraine. And now it's for us important to pave the way forward. We have 3 points that we will discuss. The first is a joint plan for competitiveness, digitalization and decarbonization. Second is to overcome our overdependencies and to create more level playing field for our economy and our businesses. Both points are basically the Draghi report. And the third element is that we boost our defense capabilities and investments and create more preparedness. This is basically the Niinistö report.
So the third element of what they'll be discussing at this meeting concerns increased defence spending. And there's going to be a lot of talk, I think, to do with European united strategies concerning defence and or unified strategy. And I guess the subject of the European army is going to be on the agenda, I think, at the moment. French Ukraine is reporting on Gabriel Attal, who was a former Prime Minister of France in the National Assembly there. Yes, there is concern about the American commitment to supporting Ukraine. We must rely more on ourselves and less on others for our security and protection. And I think you're going to see a lot of this kind of language. So Ukraine's President Zelensky arrived in Hungary today as part of the European Political Community Summit. Anton Gerashchenko explains what's going on. So two major political events are happening in Budapest on the 7th and 8th of November. The European Political Community, EPC Summit, that unites over 40 leaders from almost all European countries except for Belarus and Russia, and a summit of EU 27 leaders. So that's the European Union alone. What should we expect from the first meeting of Western heads of state after the US elections and the first visit of the Ukrainian president to Hungary since the full-scale invasion? Both Zelensky and Orban already spoke to Trump on the phone. Hungarian Prime Minister Orban spoke out about big plans for the future after his conversation with Trump today. It is highly likely that Orban will now assume the role of one of the middlemen in the negotiations with Putin. At least for the time being, the circle of potential mediators will likely be broader, and it's important to watch China's stance closely. So right now, Ukraine needs a broad coalition, and coalitions usually matter more than the mediators. So for us, it is key to broaden the circle of mediators. Knowing Putin's strategy, it's worth keeping in mind that he will stall for time. Officially, the Kremlin has stated they have no intentions of negotiating anything before the inauguration. We can expect to see a lot of misinformation about peace plans, mainly from Russian propagandists, which will try to demoralize the Ukrainian society, already anxious to the max, exhausted, and not able to discern whether the preparation of the plan ends and the real plan begins. Any talk of a very swift end to the hostilities is, unfortunately, an illusion. So finishing it in one day is obviously bonkers. And anyone that believes that just needs a head checked. Right. We need a sufficient number of weapons, not support in negotiations, says Zelensky. So this is referring back to the US plan for forced negotiations. Like, we don't need support in negotiations. We need more weapons. Hugs with Putin will not help. Some of you have been hugging him for 20 years, and things are only getting worse. He only thinks about wars that will not change. Only pressure can restrain him, said the president. And those are strong words to those European leaders. Now, I freaking love this. This is Romanian President Klaus Iohannis and Viktor Orban waiting to shake his hand. This is absolutely diamond trolling.
Elvárásokat támaszt Lengyelországgal
szemben, ami
egyértelmű, hogy az eszkalációhoz vezet. Tehát azért én azt gondolom, hogy ez egy nagyon érdekes kérdés lesz most megint csak itt a mostani találkozón, de hát az biztos, hogy a magyar miniszterelnöknek a szerepe megkerülhetetlen lesz itt az orosz-ukrán háború kapcsán, amikor ugye az amerikai béketeremtés az egyik fő fókusz lesz. Elvárásokat támaszt.
And then I presume goes over and shakes his hand and it cuts there. But absolutely hilarious that he just turns his back on him, goes and speaks to someone else, keeps Orban waiting there. It's just perfect. Absolutely love that. Right, this is Emmanuel Macron, who has been speaking quite, I think, forcefully at this meeting. He says here... Let's actually go through what he says here. So if we become the theatre of external propaganda, he says, because we are naive and think that democracy is only about providing infrastructure and not about regulating content, liberal democracies will be swept away. So I presume he's talking very forcefully about propaganda, sites like Twitter. Vladimir has just said, peace. Vladimir has just said is about helping Ukraine resist the Russian war of aggression. Our interest is the same. Our interest is that Russia does not win this war. There has been a strategic awakening that we must embrace. We Europeans do not have to delegate our security to the Americans forever. I think it is important to send the message that we are now providers of security solutions. We need to produce and adopt a European preference in this industrial production to build choices that are based on NATO interoperability, but also sometimes to accept that we will not always have the same agenda as our allies. This is not to question these alliances, but to say that we have to provide provide security solutions, especially to our neighbourhood, today on the flank and perhaps tomorrow on the southern flank. In this regard, I think we will need to develop a common culture within the European political community. A few years ago, we called it the European Intervention Initiative. It is entirely intergovernmental, and I would like to invite all colleagues and non-EU members to join. Let us extend the European Intervention Initiative to the scale of the European political community to build common intervention solutions in theatres of operation which allowed us to intervene in the Sahel region of Africa, that is. The world is made up of herbivores and carnivores. If we choose to remain herbivores, the carnivores will win. We will be a market for them. I do not think it would be bad if we decided to be omnivores. I do not want to be aggressive. I just want people to know how to defend themselves. I do not want to leave Europe as an impressive theatre inhabited by herbivores, which the carnivores will come to devour according to their agenda. Let's assume that. This is fascinating stuff, right? And I have talked to you about this before. This is essentially Karl Popper's, who is a philosopher, did a lot of philosophy of science, but he talked about the paradox of tolerance, which is if you are tolerant of other people, and here tolerance is kind of a proxy for a euphemism for liberalism, right? So if you're really, really liberal, if you're really tolerant, I'm so tolerant that I tolerate intolerant people. So let's go to Godwin's law and let's just bring in Hitler, right? So I'm so tolerant, I'm going to tolerate Hitler. Then what does Hitler do? He looks around and says, well, you're a really tolerant liberal. Oh, you'll tolerate me. Okay, I'm going to go do all my horrific stuff. And then I'm going to do that horrific stuff to you. And there's nothing you can do about it because you're just tolerating me. In other words, if we are tolerant of the intolerant, people like Hitler, those intolerant viewpoints, then the intolerant will always take advantage of the tolerant. And toleration will therefore be subsumed by the intolerant because you are tolerant of them. In other words, there's a paradox of toleration that means it's self-defeating. So I always used to talk about this with my mate about having liberalism with teeth. And this is no more apparent than in the defense sector, but you can talk about propaganda as well. You can say, and freedom of speech is this idea of toleration. I tolerate people saying anything. Freedom of speech absolutists are tolerance absolutists, but they fall foul, or society will fall foul of the paradox of tolerance, which is that when you have a place like Twitter that says, okay, I'm going to open my doors to saying people can say whatever they like, then state actors come in and start manipulating people. Like Russia comes in and spreads disinformation. You say, it's all right because I tolerate that. I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not going to censor it. I'm not going to regulate it. I'm just going to sit here and allow that to happen. And of course, what that means is the people who don't have the intellectual capacity or the intellectual tools or the time or the willpower to fight back or be able to differentiate information from disinformation will be manipulated, will be victim to that disinformation. Now, a free speech absolutist sits back and says, I'm going to allow that to happen. And what happens is huge numbers of people get disinformed, and then they make incredibly bad decisions on the back of garbage in, garbage out. And they are being manipulated, overtly manipulated by state actors. These aren't people throwing out ideas and say, let's have a good faith discussion about this idea. It's people saying, here's a lie. I'm going to lie to you. I'm going to feed you with this lie so that I can take advantage of you. Now, the free speech absolutist sits back and says, that's fine, go for it. And then you have a society full of loads and loads of people that are completely disinformed. You say, but they should be able, it's their agency, it's their choice to be able to make a decision based on, they should be free to make the correct decision. Yeah, but if they don't have the time, they don't have the inclination, they don't have the mental capabilities or just the knowledge. They might have the mental capabilities, but at this point in time, they don't have the knowledge to be able to do that and do that effectively. Then you're just going to, it's like, here's an analogy. It's like saying, well, you've got the choice. You've got the choice to be able to have a vaccine to stop you getting this particular disease, right? So that's okay. Go into this place where this disease is absolutely rife, but actually you're sending people in who haven't had a vaccine, and you're like, yeah, but they could have had a vaccine. Yeah, but they haven't got a vaccine, and you're allowing them to go into this place and get diseased. Yeah, but it's up to that. Yeah, but they don't have a vaccine. And actually that person is allergic to that vaccine, or that person, so to stop sending them into that place and then expecting, it's probably a poor analogy, but you get my point. It's like, we need to be able to have some kind of control over platforms like this so that state actors do not interfere with our free and fair elections, that do not wage war with us and win that war. They're winning the information war because we sit back and go, oh, well, whatever. Do what you like. It's up to us to be able to pick through all this crazy nonsense. And we're not really fighting back, and it's a one-sided war. Now, that is the same with the political and defence scenarios that Macron is talking about. So let's take, there are all these different analogies going on, but actually it's not an analogy, it's a parallel with freedom of speech. It's the same with toleration in terms of being a liberal international democracy, to say that, we've got all these kind of liberal rules and we tolerate an awful lot. But actually, if someone pushes back on that, if an intolerant community within our society pushes back on that, then we need to treat them with robustness. So, for example, if I have a really liberal society and some kind of far-right Nazi movement gets going and is gathering more and more momentum, I don't just sit back and go, well, I'm going to tolerate that. I'm going to say, no, that is unacceptable. Your hate and your intolerance is unacceptable. And as a liberal democracy, I'm going to treat that very seriously, and I'm going to come down hard on you like a ton of bricks, so that we maintain a society that upholds its liberal values but doesn't tolerate the intolerant. And likewise, as an international society or as a nation, you don't want to be sitting around going, we don't want to spend any money on defense, we're going to spend all our money on education or this or that, and what happens is you get taken advantage of, the people who are spending an awful lot of money on defense and then attacking other nations. So in other words, like, if you don't spend a lot of money on your insurance policy of a defense, then Russia could come along and invade you, and there ain't nothing you can do about it. So you need liberal democracies with teeth, and the teeth here are both internal policies and how you deal with propaganda and the information war, and how you deal with, say, in the example I gave, like a far-right party and a Nazi party gathering momentum. What do you do about that? But it's also, what do you do about other international entities, other nations who are challenging your liberal world order? Russia. So you need to spend a lot of money on defense, and this is what he's saying. We need to be an organization, if you're talking about the EU, of omnivores, where we are both tolerant and we've got our own really robust defense. We're not just all herbivores ready to get eaten by Russia. We aren't carnivores going around taking over the world. Like, we don't want that. The EU doesn't want to be some imperialistic Russia-like entity that goes around invading other people. So we don't want to be carnivores, and we don't want to be herbivores. We want to be omnivores. I think this is, I love this. This is thoughtful stuff from Macron. And it's definitely true. So Europe needs to be a liberal entity with teeth, and it needs to be spending lots of money on defense, putting those insurance policies in place, and standing away from the US. Now, like I said before, that may sound brilliant for the US, but I don't think it is. So I think this Trumpian isolationism, whilst it's good for Europe to stand on its own 2 feet, if you are purely looking from a US point of view, then they're not going to be buying as many articles of defense articles off the US defense industry. Now they're going to say, right, we're standing on our own 2 feet, but that our military strategy needs to integrate with our economic and industrial strategy. So we're going to be buying 60% of our own stuff rather than buying it from the US. So the move to get the EU and Europe to stand on its own 2 feet more and more is a move that pushes the EU away from both American industry and American strategic objectives. So they will become more independent and will be making decisions that aren't always in the best interest of the US, which is why the US didn't want to give up being in control of the Ukraine defense contact group, the Ramstein group. NATO wanted to take it over. US were like, no, we want to keep doing that because they get to control the narrative, get to control, what is achieved and what the objectives are, etc., etc. Now, with the Trumpian push, Trump would be like, fair enough, you go and take that. NATO can take that on. We're not even going to be all that much interested in being a part of NATO, and you guys can go and fight your own war over there. But all that means is the US becomes this kind of what we'd say little Englander or little Americana entity that is not interested in getting involved in the rest of the world. Okay, you won't be spending all that money, but you'll be suddenly your armed forces will shrink. So all those people know you need to go and get jobs. Your defense industrial base will start shrinking. You will not be the world leader. You will give up your hegemonic crown to, in this case, could be to the EU. You say, we don't want that power. We're not getting involved. That's not our war. Okay, EU takes over. The power vacuum as the US recedes is filled by hopefully the EU, but if not, Russia and China and BRICS and certainly the global south. And the US becomes a shadow of its former self. That's part of the ramifications of saying you need to stand on your own 2 feet more. So on the one hand, I completely agree, and Europe does, but from an American point of view, that is potentially a problematic position to take. That is the Trumpian view. I just think it's short-sighted from an American point of view. Now, moving on, the UK has sanctioned 56 more people and entities helping Russia's military machine. 28 companies are targeted, including the Russian mercenary group Africa Corps. They've also targeted Española, which is this another military company made up of kind of football fans. The UK has imposed sanctions on Española battalion fighting in Ukraine and the GRU officer involved in the Skripal poisoning. The UK has expanded its sanctions list against Russia. The list was supplemented with 56 individuals and organisations. Under the restrictions in particular came the battalion Española, formed from neo-Nazi football fans and fighting on the side of Russia, as well as its commander Mikhail Turkhanov. The sanctions also affected the Africa Corps, created as a replacement for PMC Wagner in Africa. Britain has also imposed sanctions against GRU agent Denis Sergeyev, who was involved in the poisoning of the Skripals, and against former president and self-proclaimed South Ossetia Anatoly Bibilov. So there you go. Good stuff for the UK there. Now, UK officials, interesting this, are privately hoping for Mike Pompeo to return as his Secretary of State because at least we've got an established relationship with him and he rates the UK. So Mike Pompeo is someone that I've previously been pretty critical of because of his kind of Republican position, etc., etc. But this is the same kind of thing that we saw with Bush, with George W. Bush, where people have looked back on the George W. Bush era almost fondly, thinking, God, that's what the Republicans used to be like. So I was writing articles against George W. Bush saying, God, this wingnut Republican who's lurching the country to the right. And I actually was seeing that as fairly moderate and stable compared to the 2016 to 2020 Trumpian administration, and then this present potential incarnation. You're thinking, goodness me, give me back George W. Bush. Whereas at the time we were like, he's mental. Now it's like, it's Mike Pompeo. Give us Mike Pompeo. Please let Mike Pompeo be in there. When previously it'd be like, God, Mike Pompeo is an absolute XYZ. So yeah, it's interesting that the UK government's hoping that someone like Mike Pompeo is in the administration to try and be at least a somewhat level head in a really chaotic environment. Now, in terms of, there was something else. There was another UK-based one. Where is it? No, there's another interesting. I think I might have it already laid up for tomorrow or something. There's an interesting article talking about how the UK has actually, like the EU, has been preparing for a Trumpian administration, and actually they're not as panicky as they might have been because they put things in place. They've got their expectations sorted out, and it might not be as crazy from a UK point of view as one might have thought. There are other issues to think about, like tariffs. I know I was reading an account of someone, I think in Pennsylvania, who was explaining to his staff at his factory that they might have to buy more X, Y, and Z ahead of the tariffs coming on board because obviously everything's going to go up in price and blah blah blah. And to a person, it seems like the staff at the factory didn't understand that they would be the ones paying the money for the tariffs, and shouldn't China be paying that? And he had to explain to all his staff that no, you don't understand how tariffs work, and that's because Trump has been misinforming you. So these people who had all apparently voted for Trump, oh what? So tariffs are a sales tax on us? Yeah, that's how it works. And as a result, we're going to have to put things in place and buy loads of stuff before January the 21st, because if tariffs come in January 21st, we're screwed. And all the staff were oh, I just voted for that because I thought, oh, this is going to be inflation. This is going to hit our pocket. Yeah, it is. It's anyway, I digress. The point here is that the UK is going to be potentially really badly damaged by trade wars that might take place due to tariffs being put in place. And either Trump is honest and he's going to fulfill his pledges like he said in his speech, or he's not. In other words, I've just told you I'm going to do all this, I'm going to get in charge and realise that all this stuff is completely unworkable, in which case I've effectively lied to the electorate, got your vote, and then after the vote comes in, whatever, doesn't really matter. Now, I know political parties often do this, which is have a manifesto, but then struggle to do it once they're in power. But I just think there's potentially a lot of disingenuous campaigning from Trump, or he's going to do that and it'll be disastrous. So FP analysis suggests that Ukraine could pursue nuclear arms if denied NATO membership. So now, the idea that the US wants to deny NATO membership for 20 years plus for Ukraine are okay, well, so that's not really going to stop Russia coming back for a second bite. We're going to get nukes back. Screw you. We're going to get nukes back because, do you know what? None of the Baltic states have been invaded by Russia. None of the Nordic states have been invaded by Russia. Although some of them only just joined NATO. Poland hasn't been invaded. Why? Because they're in NATO, protected by the EU, NATO, etc., etc. Well, if we can't join the EU and we can't join NATO, then screw you, we're going to get nukes. We can't avoid considering a nuclear weapon if it fails to join NATO, with US support expected to diminish under Trump. Decisions have consequences. Elections have consequences. Now, interestingly, Ukraine-born Democrat Vinman, so Eugene Vinman, who was a whistleblower in the Trump administration, he was then excoriated by the GOP because he whistleblowed against them. He's persona non grata as far as they're concerned. He's won a seat as a House of Representatives lawmaker in Virginia, which is really interesting. So he's now taken up politics. He's been, obviously, of Ukrainian descent, has been a massive advocate for support for Ukraine. Now, fascinating. Israeli publication Ma'ariv reports that Trump has given Netanyahu the green light that he can do whatever he wants with Iran and do what Israel needs in Gaza and Lebanon. So a couple of things here. Look at the cherry picking between, or the double standards between Israel and Ukraine. You can do whatever you want and we'll facilitate you doing everything you want. We're going to force you to go to have peace, and we're not going to give you the weapons that you want. Hang on, we were literally invaded by another country. Israel's a completely different context. We were literally no, it's all right. You have to sue for peace, and they can keep 20% of your country, and you guys can do whatever you like, and we'll help you do that. Now, what's interesting, if this is indeed true, is that part of the issue for the Harris campaign and the election was that they lost the Jewish vote because the Republicans are saying, oh, look at her support for the Palestinians. So they lost the Jewish vote. And then the campaign also, this was the America Super PAC, Elon Musk campaign, paid for Super PAC, had adverts against the Democrats saying that they were supporting the Palestinians, so lots of Jewish voters, and then they released adverts that were saying, oh, look how much they're supporting Israel, and this is genocidal and all this kind of stuff. Biden is helping the Netanyahu genocide, so they lost the Muslim voters from places like Dearborn, like the Arab voters. So Arab Democrats went across to the Republicans, and Jewish Democrats went across to the Republicans. They got hammered from both sides. And then straight away afterwards, Trump comes out and says, oh, you know those Arab voters that are voting for us because they thought that that the Democrats were supporting the Israelis too much. Well, we've given the Israelis a green light. So thanks for voting for us. Sort of. Don't really care about you. Bye. Thanks for your vote, though. Really nice. I mean, you can say it's very clever. But it was based on lying. A, it was based on lying. And B, the Democrats have a nuanced position, which is actually rather similar to my position, interestingly. Which is, we understand the Palestinians' right to exist as human beings and as a self-determining group of people. But we also understand the Israeli need to defend themselves against, say, Hamas. And it's differentiating Hamas from the Palestinians, and this is complex and it's nuanced. And so actually, we know that Joe Biden didn't like Netanyahu, doesn't like Netanyahu. He's an effing idiot, or whatever he called it. It's that nuanced approach that's trying to do well for both sets of people. But what that means is the Republicans could come along and play them off against both by kind of lying about them in both cases as well. And that's a disingenuous part of that. And as a result, the Republicans have reaped the reward of what I think is disinformation. Now, that's a lesson for the Arab voters. Don't believe Trump. Don't believe that campaign. And talking about disinformation, there's another Vacnick swoop out from Pekka Kallianiemi focusing on foreign malign influence operations during the 2024 US elections. As in 2016 and 20, these recent elections were also a target of massive disinformation and hacking campaigns originating mostly in Russia and Iran. First of all, in my opinion, is that these influence operations alone didn't affect the elections so much. They actually made a difference. These didn't affect the elections so much, but they did make a difference. Unlike in 2016, Trump's win over Harris was clear, and these short-term campaigns didn't really change that much this time. The thing is, they are still a problem, and you need to do something about it. Yet many of these online campaigns attacked both Harris and Walz on various social media platforms, especially Walz became a big target after his nomination, and many Russian efforts attempted to defame him. So Russia behind viral disinformation targeting of Tim Walz, says US official. Many of these fake stories came from Russian propaganda group Storm 1516, an offshoot of the late Yevgeny Prigozhin's infamous internet research agency. The group was discovered in 2023 by Darren Linville's team of media forensics researchers at Clemson University. And then there's an excerpt from an article on that. The group has a long history of publishing deepfakes and fake whistleblower videos, and the false sexual abuse claim of Tim Walz came from them. Storm 1516 was also behind the fake hit and run story about Kamala Harris. So Russia propaganda group behind fake Kamala Harris hit and run story, says Microsoft, peddled by actors and false primary sources. And these fall apart under just a routine inspection of them. Russian propaganda unit appears to be behind spread of false Tim Walz sexual abuse claims. Anyway, Trump's allies have also spread these claims online, including people like Pizzagate promoter Jack Posobiec, and far-right podcaster Candace Ernst, Another large Twitter account, Black Insurrectionist, who's actually a white dude named Jason G. Palmer, also spread fake emails about this story, eventually nuking their accounts. Another fake video showing a man searching through mail-in ballots from Pennsylvania and ripping up those with a vote for Trump was first posted in October 2024 from an account that promotes the QAnon conspiracy theory and has been linked to Storm 1516. The smear campaign against Harris and Walz originates from John Mark Dougan, a former Florida cop and now Moscow resident who runs a massive network of AI-generated fake news websites. Dougan's also behind most of the anti-Zelensky campaigns online, and you can see that in a previous Vacnick Soup on John Mark Dougan himself. Another Kremlin operation before the election was, of course, the case of Tenet Media, Tennessee-based company that received $10 million from Russia through various shell companies. The money was used to pay YouTubers for producing anti-Ukraine content. Tenet Media paid big influencers like Tim Pool and Benny Johnson to produce and spread pro-Kremlin and anti-Ukraine content through their YouTube channels. All creators involved in this scheme claimed they didn't know where the money came from. In addition, there were several AI-driven botnets amplifying pro-Trump messages on X. Allegedly, many of the networks were shut down after the elections, resulting in a loss of several hundreds or even thousands of followers, as reported by many large Twitter accounts. This is really interesting. So I've heard a lot of people complaining that they suddenly lost 250 followers, like in a day, and that could well be because even if they're pro-Ukrainian, they're being monitored by these bot accounts. Well, actually not monitored. They are. That's what the bots do, is they go on these people, they follow these people and then spread disinformation. And now they're trying to clean up after the election and make sure that the election's been and done. That's all happening. That's all happened, and we don't necessarily need to have so much bot activity. So shut down a load of these bot farms or whatever. And people have lost loads of followers. Like Tim White was saying that this morning. He's lost 250 followers. Like almost certainly Russian bots. Interference. CNN reported on another incident in which American social media influencer Alpha Fox 78 was paid around $100 per post by a Russian pro-Kremlin propagandist named Seaman Ozzy Cossack Boykov. Incidentally, Foxy has been quiet during the last few days. Ozzy Cossack, I think it was him that earlier on in the war was trying to dox me or said something about, does anyone know where this guy lives or something, when I was posted something. So screw you. Or I think from one of my videos. Anyway, both campaigns were also targeted by Iranian hackers. They managed to hack several email accounts of the Trump campaign, but unlike in 2016, most media outlets refused to publish any of the hacked information. Eventually, Ken Klippenstein published a JD Vance dossier. So that was a dossier they got from the Trump campaign. That was the opposition research, if you like, on JD Vance to make sure that he was going to be okay as a VP pick. Like in 2016, spoiler candidate Jill Stein was also heavily promoted, this time to Muslim voters by both domestic MAGA Republicans and foreign influence campaigns. You can read more about Mrs. Stein here, so there's another Vacnit Soup thread on her. Of course, these operations are just the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of similar but smaller scale campaigns that attempt to influence the US voters. The V-Square article that I dipped into was exceptional. Leaked files from Putin's troll factory, how Russia manipulated European elections. Well worth a read. So what do we have? X did absolutely nothing to stop them, and anyone drawn to conspiracy theories could even question the platform's owners' motives for this. So it has been absolute patent disregard for disinformation from Elon Musk, who said he was going to squash disinformation quash it on his site when he took over, is absolutely done the opposite. He's allowed it to take. In fact, he's spread it himself. He's amplified disinformation himself, as analyses have shown. He spread election disinformation to a massive degree. He amplified it to his 200 million followers. And he has allowed the site to be manipulated by the Russians to the benefit of Trump, which is to the benefit of Musk, because Musk gets a position in the administration as the richest man in the world with another billionaire, with these tech bros of Peter Thiel and David Sachs being involved. You just got some big oligarchy running the country. Twitter's become a propaganda arm of the GOP, in line with Talk Radio, in line with Sinclair Media for local news stations, in line with Fox Media as the biggest national media organisation. They control all the messaging. And if you look at the top 4 Spotify podcasts, they're all right. So talk about Candace Owens. I think she's number 3. It goes Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and the 4th one I forget is also a GOP propaganda arm. Basically, they are controlled, and this is part of the reason why, like I told you the other day, the Harris campaign lost is that you can't compete in the information spaces. The Democrats need to compete in the information space. They absolutely got hammered in the information spaces. The Republican campaign very cleverly spent $95 million on, immigrant transgender people in prison getting transgender gender operations, right? $95 million on those adverts, and they had a massive effect. They were really, really powerful and very, very popular, apparently. They did the work they were intended to do. Do you know how many people had those operations? 2 people. So you're comparing $95 million spent on an issue that concerned 2 people that trumps, pun intended, trumps, say, economic policy, an 83-page economic policy that's going to put loads more money into the hands of working class and the middle class, etc., etc. It's like, so you've got these kind of this like 2 people's operations. That culture wars thing that was amplified to be massive is seen as more important than all this other sensible policy, all this other stuff that's really like building 3 million houses. Not as important as 2 people's operations. And so when you get that amplification that is taking place from within, like the, if you like, the legal framework, and then you have the illegal, the disinformation amplification from Russia, you can start to understand why the election went in the way that it did. As Pekka finishes, like in 2016 and 2020, foreign influence operations mostly attack Trump's adversaries. So there's little or to no incentive to try to weed them out before the elections. So, you know, the Republicans are not going to try and weed them out. They're absolutely useful for them. To the victor belong the spoils, as they say. And none of this matters anymore now that Musk and Trump managed to win the race. If Trump decides to follow the Project 2025 path, there would be even less money and resources to fight against online disinformation. So in other words, stripping out the government, purging the government of anti-government checks and balances, basically, and the desire to bring disinformation accounts to bring disinformation sources to account, there'll be even less ability for the US government to and desire for the US government to step in and regulate and do things that will help the information spaces. This is a real worry, and Russia have taken advantage of that already, and that's before these guys. That's to get these guys in position. Going forward, the next 4 years, I think is going to be an information shit show, absolute disaster, and that's why, you know, I would love to go to somewhere like Blue Sky that's much safer environment, it's safe space, blah blah blah. But like, it just hopefully disinformation is better differentiated there and closed down from taking hold. Yeah, I'm no fan of Elon Musk, that's for sure. But anyway, lots hopefully for you to think about. And not all of you are going to agree with this, of course. There would be your freedom of speech advocates, your absolutists out there. But of course, you believe in regulation of freedom of speech in other places. So I don't understand why you cherry pick. It's kind of weird. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you. It's a discussion I've had many times. And if you want to know my true thoughts about freedom of speech with some philosophical foundations to it, please check out my freedom of speech videos. I've done 2 of them on this channel. Just go and do the search on the channel page and look for them. Anyway, take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.